because you start at 3:40. What we're doing is an extension of what we did earlier when we screened Tunde Kelani's film. So there's a book that has been published about '50, but the book was done when he was 70. But that's not for me to say. I'd like to invite one of the co-authors and co-initiators of the book, Dr. Tunde Adegbola.
Thank you very much. Actually, German is right, because the idea of writing a book about Tunde Kelani started when he turned 50. And we did try to get a book in his honor at that time, but somehow it didn't work. We tried at 60. Somehow it didn't work, but even at 70 it didn't work, so it's now worked at 71. Thank you very much. It's with great pleasure that I present this book today. The story about the book, I think, is best told by a mythical Yoruba figure called Mogudu. If anybody has heard the popular Obe song, you know that when the elephant died, Mogudu cleaned up after it. When the buffalo died, Mogudu cleaned up after it. But when Mogudu died, there was no one to clean up after Mogudu. And in a sense, that's the situation with TK. TK has celebrated many Africans of worth. He has acknowledged our powerful writing clan by adapting their books into the screen productions. He has adapted books from Akiu Mishola, Femi Oshofisan, Wole Soyinka, name them. Our really, really powerful collective of authors. He has dedicated some of his films to some of the most significant Nigerians. We're talking about Taisho Larin, Hubert Ogunde, Basi Anda, various people of worth. He has taken time to celebrate the Nigerians that are not usually celebrated. He has been able to provide for us an alternative to some of the many times ne'er-do-well political figures that Nigeria celebrates naturally. And that was the background to doing a book for Tunde Kelani at 70. It is not really a book about Tunde Kelani. It is a book for Tunde Kelani because it's a collection of writings from film scholars around the world. We have about 12 authors spanning countries from North America to Africa to Austria, Ghana, the United States of America, to come around and give us an idea about film and its development in Nigeria. The book is titled Camera, Conscience, and Commerce. And the subtitle is Afrowood and the Crisis of Purpose, a book in honor of Tunde Kelani. And when we talk about camera, commerce, and conscience, allow me to read a paragraph from one of the chapters that really explains to us the whole idea about camera, conscience, and purpose. As a producer, Tunde Kelani maintains a clear understanding of what the viewing audience expects of him, and he even manages to castigate them while they enjoy it. He maintains a strong relationship with the traditional Yoruba theater movement, which constitutes a major group from which he draws actors and actresses. They also, in their own part, accord him high regard, acknowledging him as a vital link between their history on stage and presence on the cinema screen. Unfortunately, however, with all his other enviable skills, one vital producer's skill that continues to elude TK is how to get money out of a Nigerian bank. So therein lies this contradiction between camera, commerce, and conscience. This has been the environment in which TK has made all his films, armed with his camera, propelled by his conscience, but constrained by commerce, constrained by making films that actually speak, not films that titillate, not films that just excite the base instinct, but films that actually speak to people. So it is with great joy that I want to invite up here Mr. Tunde Kelani. She has the books I want. Okay. Well, I don't know, 6 people. Yeah. That will be with you. Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, you just make this a quick ritual. Jonathan Haynes, who is in the book. You are so prominent today. my friend, what are you doing? Please join us. Dr. Paul Ugo. Professor Linus Abraham. Oh, Grandpa Chike is there already, so I won't call him. Abagba is Brian Larkin. There are 6 books there, so you have. So it doesn't look like Professor Awam Ankpa. So I don't know how to conduct this. I think TK will speak and then we'll raise the book. And he's not read the book. So all your ashiri is in the book. So.
But it's an effort.
Yes. I hope you are not going to sue them after this whole exercise. But you can speak briefly to you and then we raise the book and then take picture and then we.
Well, I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for witnessing this moment in my career. And a lot of people had wondered, what makes the Tunde Kelani film different? And I told people that I went to the academics in the first place because I needed them. And at best, what they've done is giving my work an intellectual bent. And I saw that there has to be a collaboration between the university, the institutions, and my work. Because I said, honestly, that what filmmaking does for me is give me the legitimate reason or excuse to learn forever. So I still continue to do that. I learn every time. And at the beginning of Nollywood, I started to recognize names of Brian Larkin, Jonathan Haynes, and Okome Okome, Paul Ugo, and all the intellectuals, all the academics, that gave Nollywood a chance. In fact, I dare say that the recognition, intellectualism or academics in Nollywood came from outside. And they had had a head start of almost 10 years before our intellectuals at home started to really believe there was something to Nollywood. You know, so for me, today, if there's a panel, and then for me, I'm invited to sit amongst the academics. They're all professors, they're doctors. Only me. I'm left. And I quickly point out that actually I'm not one of you. That I get crushed in any case. And during the session they had on Fela Conference, University, but I was invited again, you know, on the high table or the podium. And then I insisted that, well, I can take part only if you borrow me professorship. And Twin Fadullah, of course, got up and said, by the honors, you know, conferred on me. He said, how many minutes do you want? So I did 10 minutes, 10 minutes. I now make you a professor for 10 minutes. You know. Anyway, I'm really happy that this is happening. Because he said in 50, when I'm 50, when I'm 70, 71, that this actually happened in my time. So I thank you all. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.
We're not going yet. Please clap for Professor Tunde Kelani. For 10 minutes. Clap for 10 minutes. I've just been reminded that we're playing a game that is very dangerous. Actually, we're supposed to have done this during the screening of the film. So we invited 2 top Nigerian filmmakers, female. But I just discovered that they have left here. So I'm going to use my discretion, if you allow me, to summon 2 people here who will join us so that we're politically correct. Caroline, please. Are you still in the room? And our dear auntie, who is an inspiration always. Oh, Yemi. I know you, yes, you deal with me later, but you have someone to call me.
I'm not sure.
You see, Auntie Oyemi has to dress up to come out. You don't need it, man. She's always a great supporter, always here for all our events. Your book, man. So, TOJ, you have to take your picture fresh now. Sound, please, the standing mic, please bring it now. No, we're supposed to hold the book. Grandpa Professor TK, that's not how to hold it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The only professor, how to teach them how to see the way professor is only doing. Just look at the way Auntie Oyemi is so with a poise. I mean, you know, please give a round of applause to the elegant lady there. Well, thank you very much. Chike, we're very happy that this has come out. We've been worried that Tunde Kelani, we don't have publications on Tunde Kelani. Every time they ask for an interview, we have to go to the New York interview of 1996. That's what we always have to send out. I mean, this has given us another material. Thank you very much. I'm sure when the people who are speaking, they will be talking to the book to Professor Paul Ugo, who already. Professor Tunde Kelani. Yes, okay. For 10 minutes. And Professor Awan will be talking about it on Saturday and Sunday. And so we go on like that. And thank you very much. Yes. The next session is immediate, because Professor Linus Abraham is going to be talking with us. No, well, we're collecting the books back. Oh. It's called 2,500. Please. It's downstairs. 2,000, sorry. The book is 4,000 outside of this place, but today it is 2,500. Buy one, get one free. But don't ask me. Please, this announcement is very important. Please, TOJ, please. This announcement is very important. Dr. Paul Ugo, always very instant and constant. I just made an offer now, especially for young film enthusiasts or film students or film scholars and co. So he needs to say it himself. I will not say it on his behalf.
I mean, it's not a big deal. So here's the deal. I want one person in this hall or in Lagos or anyone you know who can write a PhD thesis on Tunde Kelani to come and work with me in the US.
Okay, so you see Dr. Paul Ugo, and then it's from the Illinois State University, and is a professor of media. So we have Professor Linus Abraham. I'm sure some of us are familiar with Linus Abraham. We've asked him to prepare a paper, but we've also appealed to him to speak to the paper because we do not have time to take the full paper. But we will make the paper available once you have your email registered downstairs, we'll make the paper available. It will always be on our website, so you can download it. Because immediately after his presentation, we have two people who are going to be discussing this presentation. Professor Brian Larkin will be coming here later after the presentation, and then Uncle Frank Alim is a cultural researcher and publisher of Shekere. He's at the back there. Thank you very much, Uncle Frank. So the two of them will be here to respond or to support Professor Linus' paper on storytelling and African identity. Please, let's give them a listen. Please, ushers, can you clear the... Please, let's clear the side there. So I leave you in the hand of Professor Linus Abraham. Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon. I was, for some time now, I've felt a little bit lost. It's my first time at iREP, and I was wondering if I really belonged here, because I'm a Ghanaian too. But I was sitting beside Professor Awam, and he reminded me that the genesis of iREP was, what was the name of, there was a grouping that used to meet in Ghana, in Accra. Ifo was part of it. Professor Awam was part of it. Our Honorable MC was also part of it. I'm trying to remember the name of the group now. Something Documentaries. Professor Awam, excuse me, what was the name of the group that used to meet in Ghana at NAFTI? Real Life Documentaries. And he was reminding me that the motivation for iREP was from Real Life Documentaries. At that time, I was director of the National Film and Television Institute in Ghana, and we used to meet there. Unfortunately, Ghanaians didn't seem to be too interested in the grouping. So somewhere along the line, they decided that why don't we move this to Nigeria? And it tells you the spirit of determination of the Nigerian people. So we should give them a clap of hands for bringing them here. And Professor Jonathan, I share very much your ideals about liberal studies and film, incorporating liberal studies and film. As a matter of fact, when I was director of NAFTI, I changed the curriculum. And I made it 50% liberal studies and 50% professional courses. But I tell you, there were some challenges. Because once we did that, we brought the liberal studies courses, we found out that we didn't have time for the professional courses. So it's a balancing act. But I totally agree in that philosophy, and I think it's something that needs to be promoted. All filmmakers have to realize that the power that they have in defining identities in society. So I think it brings a certain responsibility of them becoming educated, also in the liberal arts, as a foundation to make sure that we have the right kinds of storytelling to develop the right kinds of identity for Africa. So thank you very much for bringing that up today. Interestingly, this topic came to me late, storytelling and African identity. And when they told me the topic, I said, oh, what have these people done to me? Because if you're in the area of critical cultural studies, you realize that there are so many contentious issues that deal with storytelling and especially identity and African identity, if you start defining them. But the topic suggests a causal relationship between storytelling and identity, and more specifically, African identity. But it then immediately raises questions of the relationship between discourse, power, knowledge, and identity. I'm seeing film storytelling as forms of discourse, a discursive medium for construction of identities in society. I tend to come from much more of a critical perspective. Professor Jonathan, coming from the English Studies Department, is more functional in its deliberations of issues. But I tend to take a much more critical cultural approach. So I tend to be a little bit more political. So as we go on, you realize that the orientation in terms of understanding this topic focuses much more on the political matrix of issues of storytelling and identity construction in society. But it then immediately raises the questions of relationship between discourse, power, knowledge, and identity, thinking of film as what? A mode of discourse. What is the ideal or not ideal story being told? Who is telling them, and with what effect on the African identity being constructed? So there's a very political relationship, and I don't think many of us as filmmakers understand the political implications of the medium that we hold and the kinds of images that we construct. Not surprisingly, there are contentious debates on what constitutes an authentic African cinema. Not just whose storytelling can be deemed African, but intensely whether the storytelling should be geared towards political deconstruction of the political gaze that has traditionally created inferior African identities, or should the storytelling model the global market trends of genre films for commercial purposes and escapism? After all, we are all modern global citizens. Those of you who understand the debates that are going on between those areas probably know what it is that I'm talking about, and it's a current conflict that's taking place right now. In this presentation, I will discuss what is storytelling and its importance, storytelling as a meaning-making technology, storytelling as discursive avenue for identity construction and its power implications, what constitutes the ideal African story and storytelling, and then discuss the philosophy of the paradigm of African identity and development as a way of suggesting the boundaries of the ideal type of African storytelling that we should focus on. So what is storytelling? Storytelling essentially describes the social and cultural activity of sharing stories. Every culture has its own stories or narratives, which are shared as a means of entertainment, education, cultural preservation, or instilling moral values. Storytelling is as old as any culture, it was a primary means of passing along information long before the written word ever existed. As often used, the term storytelling can refer in a very narrow sense, specifically to oral storytelling in its performance settings, and also in a looser sense to techniques used in other media to unfold or disclose the narrative of a story. In indigenous cultures, storytelling was used as an oral form of language associated with practices and values essential to developing one's identity. Excuse me. Is there reverberation? Can they do anything about that? Okay. Okay. In the contemporary sense, as Professor Jonathan said, technological revolutions in communication have radically expanded the reach of storytelling beyond its limited geographical confines of particular spaces. New forms of media are creating new ways for people to record, express, and consume stories. Documentaries, including interactive web documentaries, employ storytelling narrative techniques to communicate information about the topic. In Africa, storytelling is deeply rooted in our cultures. Since ancient times, storytelling in the African culture has been a way of passing on traditions, codes of behavior, as well as maintaining social order. While writing had not been developed in ancient Africa, storytelling provided Africans an oral means to transmit their thoughts, beliefs, and feelings. Now, I want to talk a little bit about storytelling as a meaning-making technology that we use to explain our lives. Stories are technologies of meaning-making that human beings use to answer questions and explain the complexities of their lives. They are a central part of human communication, whether in the form of a novel, history text, a song, news story, a painting, or film. They are meaning-making forms that help us to answer the questions who, what, when, how, and why of particular events that we encounter and experience in our lives. Human life and existence is so complex. Events spanning the parts of our lives sometimes leave us baffled. Sometimes they leave us crying. Other times they leave us laughing. Often we are left with questions about the experiences that the human mind seeks to answer. Essentially, human beings are meaning-making mechanisms. We are always looking for meaning in our lives. When events happen to us, we want to answer the questions of who, what, why, when, the reasons why they happened, in order to understand what has happened to us and then see how we move forward from there. And this is where the edge to create and tell stories come from. It is because of the human need for explanation and meaning. Humans hunger for meaning. Why do nice people always finish last? And do they really? Why do disasters happen? Why are churches also destroyed in earthquakes? The more we look at what remains unexplained in our lives, the more we have the edge to create stories. We use narrative fiction, documentary, journalism, or other forms as vehicles for proposing questions, ideas, and possible solutions and meanings. Often a person needs to attempt to tell the story of an experience before realizing its value. In this case, it is not only the listener who learns, but the teller who also becomes aware of his or or her own unique experiences and background. Stories, therefore, are important to tell, not only for those who get to relive them, but for those who can listen and learn from them. Stories allow for everyone to express all of their identities and to share information in their cultures. Storytelling is what connects us to our humanity, as Ifo says. It is what links us to our past and provides a glimpse of our future. So it's a very important mechanism in our lives. It helps us make meaning of the complexities of our lives, and we shouldn't take that for granted. So what is the importance of storytelling then? Nathaniel Rawson compares the importance and impact of storytelling on culture to passing on our genetic code. He summarizes the importance of storytelling in this way. He says, I find storytelling to be at the utmost importance in measuring the effect and longevity of culture. Wives' tales, ghost stories, fairy tales are all reflections of the society in which they take place, in addition to what values are carried through generations. Furthermore, it is because of storytelling that so many industries are able to have widespread success and influence. It is the expression of our legacies, lessons, and histories that ensure cultural identity remains intact, akin to passing on our genetic code, because the stories that make up our development can determine what our future will be. Very, very important implications of storytelling in terms of being able to connect our past to what our future is going to be. I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that storytelling has very strong political implications, and that we need to pay attention to the kinds of stories that we tell. It's not something that we should take for granted. Every day, on a daily basis, we tell stories to ourselves, to friends, and so on. These stories have very powerful implications in terms of the way they shape our thought processes. So it's something that we need to, something that we shouldn't take for granted. You come to realize that stories have become very important in advertising and marketing. And quite often they tell you that some of the those companies that are doing very well have commercials that emphasize storytelling, very importantly. It's no longer the case that these commercials that they churn out emphasize what? Informational approaches. No. These days, it's much more storytelling in the commercials that they create. And in many of the commercials, you wouldn't even see a mention of the company, the product, until the very end of the commercial, after they've told the story. Some of the Glow commercials fascinate me in terms of the stories that they tell. You see market traders, market women, fighting with each other, rushing to adopt technologies, but it's only at the end that you see what? The brand of the product that's being sold. They sell you entertaining stories that make you pay attention to whatever is being promoted. Now, Paul Jarvis has done some research that established that the use of narratives helps human brain to focus and thus learn better. Stories are a catalyst for emotion, since they take facts and other things we want to retain and put them into an emotional structure. So for many of us who do documentaries, quite often you see the tendency to tell you that use character-driven narratives in some of the documentaries that you create. Because in many documentaries, and in many African documentaries, you realize that there's a strong aggregation of facts. They tend to be thematic in the form in which they go. The advice is that sometimes if you use character-driven you make character-driven documentaries, they tend to bring much more emotion to the development of the stories that you create. So it's a strategy that we need to learn sometimes. These days, as you've said, in the creation of content, storytelling is key. I think it's about the third or the fourth time that we are hearing that today. Storytelling in this creation of content becomes a very valuable and necessary skill. For those who consume content, a good story makes consuming the content that much easier. It is often assumed that simply having good content or having a good idea will translate into good stories, though this is often far from the truth. Indeed, the ability to tell a good story can be an extremely useful tool. A recent Harvard's Business Review article discussed the issue of storytelling and its importance, concluding that during this time of information saturation, telling a good story is essential to being heard and getting your message across. So all of us as documentary filmmakers have to learn the art and the skill of storytelling, because that's what will make you cut through the information overload that exists these days. And now let me go really to the import of what it is that I want to talk about. And this is storytelling as a political praxis in terms of construction of identities. Let me see, let me move this in. It's a bit difficult to see from here on the screen. As we have noticed, storytelling as a medium of communication does not only provide entertainment, it also provides information and facilitates learning. But it can also be a technology of power that can be used consciously or unconsciously to shape the attitudes and identities of people, either enslaving them or liberating them from the dominant hegemonies. In this sense, questions of who is telling the story, for what purpose, to what effect, and in whose interest are questions that come to the fore. Therefore, some academic approaches treat narratives or stories as politically motivated stories that may enslave some groups or empower certain groups and free them from their enslavement. Instead of just searching for the main point of the narrative, the political function is demanded through asking whose interest does a story serve. This approach mainly looks at the power, authority, knowledge, ideology, and identity, whether it legitimates and dominates or resists and empowers. From this political praxis, stories, narratives provide a privileged site for the analysis of identity. This is because narratives are productive sites of active and effective identity construction. Stories become discursive sites with implications of power in shaping identities of individuals and groups in societies. Naturally, Africans who have been disparaged and been made to feel inferior by Western storytelling have been asked to tell their own stories in the process of emancipating themselves. So questions about what is an African story and what is an authentic African story have become central discussions since the development of African cinema after colonization. What is really an African story to tell? What is an authentic African story? From the political perspective, these are important questions because then the notion of political economy of storytelling, who owns it? Who is telling the story? With what effect? What kind of story is being told becomes very, very important. Now, Chiu-Yap, in his article titled African Cinema's Definitions, Identity, and Theoretical Considerations, which largely draws on the insights from African film, New Formations of Aesthetics and Politics by Mantia Diawara, contends that there's a shift in perceptions of what constitutes authentic African cinema and what should be geared towards African cinema. He writes, contemporary directors, many of whom have not experienced traumatic colonial experiences, do not feel compelled to film back, that's looking back at our history, or be politically committed. Since the 1990s, these directors have abandoned the ideologically oriented aesthetics of pioneer African filmmakers, which they severely criticize. Whereas pioneer filmmakers obsessively focused on a critique of colonial and post-colonial Africa, or the rehabilitation of a mutilated identity and distorted history, post-1990 directors resolutely go beyond nationalism and situate their discourses on the turbulent flows of globalization, contemporary films are less moralizing, less didactic, less concerned with legitimizing the nation than previous ones, as were the case in Sembene's films. He argues that what may be called popular African cinema, and when we are talking about popular African cinema, I don't think there's any better example than Nollywood these days. Nollywood essentially represents filmmaking in Africa. They capture it. He argues that what may be called popular African cinema seems to focus very much on generic specific films, with a choice of genre directed towards commercial and entertainment cinema. Two opinions which were considered as almost heretical practices in the peak of nationalist filmmaking. He argues that the well-known African cinema is on the verge of being buried by a generation of directors who not only did not experience colonialism as Sembene did, but also do not feel obliged to speak for the African people or teach them anything. Not surprisingly, these discursive formations have, at times, been criticized by scholars who seem concerned with the loss of an African ontology or an African cinema that should remain immune to alienation, all the while conserving its purity. Mantia Darawara contends that these formal experimentations with the global genre systems are nothing but a mere recourse to Eurocentric formalism, which represses the contents of their lives and privileges the position of Western spectators in the art of cinema. So in this case then, given the two opposing sides in terms of the political orientation to film, as opposed to the much more modern trends that you are finding in Nollywood and so on, emphasizing the genre system and commercial filmmaking, what is the ideal African storytelling to shape an appropriate African identity? Is a question that all of us have to think about. In light of the above discussion, how can we then define African cinema? There's likely no straightforward answer. What is clear, though, is that no single conceptualization suffices. But given the contested nature of the ideal African cinema, I tried to reflect on what may constitute appropriate African storytelling to effect the ideal African identity or identities that we can imagine to ensure the development of African people. The goal of any form of storytelling essentially is to answer questions. The goal of any form of storytelling, I think, should be geared towards what? Development of the African people. And it's something that we really need to focus on. Undergirding the contested nature of African cinema are arguments about the crisis of African identity and the need for an African renaissance in consciousness that will lead to the development of the continent. Here, the hegemonic role of storytelling in raising the consciousness of the African people becomes paramount. In reflecting on what may constitute the ideal African cinema to effect the appropriate African identity, I draw on Frank Okema in Dubussy's philosophical paradigm of African identity and development. In Dubussy's project is to draw on contemporary African philosophical inquiry to chart a course for delivering Africa from its identity crisis to show the way for the appropriate development of the continent. He summarizes this philosophy as this: Africa's truncated slave trade, racialism, and colonial experiences shook the foundations of the traditional conceptual paradigms, institutions, and worldviews that existed in Africa. And having passed through these crucial dislocations, it calls for a critical inquiry from which we can discern fundamental elements vital for the continent's development. The African now wishes to concretize its social, political, religious, economic, and cultural ideas as an independent, free, and mature human being. He wishes to be the master of his world with its burdens and joy, to count and be counted in the family of nations. Here, a philosophical paradigm of African identity and development tries to bring out the way people think with the aim of rediscovering and situating them on the right track, that is, being original and authentic with a view of arriving at a desired goal. It is critical inquiry done on the concepts and manner of African identity and development. Calling for a Black Renaissance, he notes that the first condition for Black Renaissance is the knowledge of the fact that there is this African problem of economic backwardness, political instability, technological inertia, and total dependence on the West. The problem is the total dependence on the West. So whatever form of filmmaking that we are making, whether commercial, genre-based, or whatever it is, love stories, whether they are detective stories or whatever it is, he is trying to call on us as Africans to first and foremost think of the condition of Africa. In whatever story that you are writing, as a means of identifying what needs to be done in your storytelling. Having recognized the importance of storytelling as an important tool for meaning making and a tool for identity formation, I adopted this philosophy in suggesting that African filmmakers, as important storytellers shaping the future of our nations and peoples, should consider a state of development and identity crisis in telling stories that have the goal of emancipating the African people. This sounds rather grandiose, and as if it harkens back to notions of authentic African cinema with their political goal of deconstruction of colonial and post-colonial structures that engendered Africans' identity crisis. Yes, it is part of that, but it is also more. It also gives a call to the newer generation of filmmakers, especially Nollywood, that see beyond nationhood and identity and see themselves as part of the global community, pushing current trends of genre-oriented and more commercial films. I think both trends of filmmaking can coexist. We can have meta-narrative films that are very political in their goals, but also very commercial in appealing to a popular audience. I give the example of Afolayan's films. For example, October 1st. You realize that if you take a very good look at it, it's genre-based. It's a detective film trying to solve a particular crime problem. But it's also very heavily political in its orientation in terms of deconstructing the structures of colonization that existed in our society. I give the example of also Femi's film, Giddy Blues. You realize that it's genre-based in terms of being a love story essentially, but it's also deconstructive in terms of structures of domination in our society. You take a look at what's the fishing community underneath the bridge. You deconstruct that idea of the fact that these people are serving us, but we are not contributing towards their development. So I believe that both of them can be done. And so given the hegemonic importance of storytelling, Africans should first and foremost be telling their own stories. For far too long, African identity and condition has been shaped in foreign and Western lands that have denigrated and dehumanized our identities for purposes of enslaving and colonizing us. But in telling our own stories, we shouldn't do the same. We tend to do very much a lot of that. And we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of that and try to make changes in terms of telling the appropriate stories. It is important we move the locus of storytelling to Africa. Africans should tell their own stories. Lloyd Wilson makes reference to a story reprinted from the Tar Heel Junior historian. It goes this way. The young boy went to his grandfather and said, "Grandfather, is it true that the lion is the king of the jungle?" "Yes," said the old man. "But why do you ask?" "Well," said the boy, "in all the stories that I read, and even in the ones I hear, man will always defeat the lion. So how can this be true?" The old man looked his grandson in the eyes and said, "It will always be that way, my son, until the lion tells the story himself," giving us the understanding that we have to tell our own stories. But I make the point that in telling our own stories, filmmakers should be aware of their power to shape African identities. Our storytellers should be part of the renaissance of the African personality and identity. In their storytelling, they should adopt the philosophical paradigm of African identity and development. A Nigerian poet and critic, Odia Ofeimon, in an interview for an article titled "What Hollywood Tells Us About Nigeria," bemoans the lack of knowledge of the reality that should inform representations on the screen. He's talking about the fact that before representation, there is a knowledge that exists that as filmmakers we should know. And it harkens to your notion of liberal studies, teaching history, political science, and so on. He bemoans the fact that quite often when you see the representations, they don't resemble anything in terms of what it is that exists on the ground. But this is something that African filmmakers will have to study. I think it's very, very important important. Through institutions like iREP, we are being taught ways of effective storytelling, and it's important that this theme exists. But it's also important, and I harken back to what he says again, that we should learn our own histories, we should learn our own philosophy, political science, and so on. These are mediums through which African filmmakers can ensure that they are creating the right stories for the development of the right kinds of identities. Thank you very much.
Please let's put our hands together once again for Professor Linus Abraham. Thank you, sir, for that presentation. I think as he was speaking, I just realized that truly we are all a product of the stories we've heard. Whether the stories are true or whether they are untrue, we are truly all a product of the stories we've heard. And I always say some of us are more Western than those who live in the West, because we've grown up on all sorts of content, whether it's on TV or on digital media. We are all a product of things that we've heard. And one of the things that I'll take away from what he said is that African storytellers should realize the power that we have in shaping our narrative. And so when we are telling our stories, we should not just tell stories for the sake of being a filmmaker or for the sake of telling stories, or not telling them, being not conscious of the fact that we're actually shaping the minds of the people that are consuming our stories. So it's very important to know that the media is one of the most powerful tools in the world for world domination. It is one of the most powerful tools, and the countries and societies that understand the power of that world domination are using it to shape all of us. And many of us are just consuming without realizing that we are being sold philosophies and paradigms in our minds that are shaping the way that we see the world and that we interpret the lives that we live. So it's very powerful and it's very important. Let's put our hands together once again. Very quickly, we'll be going into about 15-minute panel discussion based on the presentation that we've heard, and I'll be quickly inviting up the three panelists, well, two panelists and one moderator. First, I'll invite up Professor Paul Ugo, who is going to be the moderator for this panel. He's from Illinois State University and is the professor of literature and cultural studies. So storytelling and African identity is very central to everything that he does and to what he teaches in school. And then I'll invite Mr. Brian Larkin, professor of anthropology. Professor Brian Larkin, please put your hands together for him. Professor of anthropology from the Barnard College, Columbia University, at the director, the Center for Comparative Media. And then Frank Halim, I hope I got that pronunciation right, sir. Thank you. Publisher of Shekere, also known as Obanya. Forgive me if I murdered this. Please put your hands together. So together they'll just have a discussion on Professor Linus's presentation. I'll start.
Okay, so I'm just standing in for Jaman. He was supposed to be the moderator of this panel, so I had nothing to do with it. They just recruited me a couple of seconds ago and I signed up. But I heard that it was Brian, my friend, and you know, they were going to be on this panel. I said it's an easy job and I'm happy to do that. Now, I met Professor Linus for the first time yesterday evening. And after we had, no, he did not participate. I had a glass of wine. Just to welcome myself home, and then we drove in the same car back to the hotel. But when he was giving his talk, I kept on looking at my laptop because I thought he stole my paper. It is what I am going to be talking about tomorrow, the idea of stories as political weapons. The notion of stories as political knowledge is what he articulated today. The point he made is that storytelling is a meaning-making system, but that it is also ideological work. And it is that ideological work, the import of ideological work, that he was trying to unpack for us. So it is an honor to moderate this panel. I would assign, say, 2 minutes each. And then after 2 minutes, I will be very ruthless in terms of moderating time. And then we'll go to him. And then after that, maybe we might have a few questions. Brian, you can begin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. It was a very stimulating and intelligent talk. And I had one question, which is a genuine problem that comes up for me, which is, given that we know all societies change, and if they change, that means we have our storytelling that we pass down, but we also borrow from other cultures. And the tension sometimes comes up is how much do we borrow, and how much we want to grow and develop, then we're going to change. And then we're going to borrow from outside. I'll give an example I'm familiar with. In the north of Nigeria, their films borrow from Indian films. And the filmmakers have been very, very heavily criticized for borrowing storytelling that comes from Indian films. But the filmmakers themselves say, well, we borrow from Indian films to critique things going on in our society. So they say we are commending right and forbidding wrong, and we're using this in order to critique these things. I think if you go back to Nietzsche market pamphlets, there was that same issue that they were using new forms of storytelling to critique elders. And so I was interested in your sense of figuring out an African ontology. Where is the boundary? Because oftentimes the politics lies in that discussion of what's appropriate to borrow, what can we not borrow. Because I thought that was one of the most interesting things in the talk. Thank you.
Yeah. I have to be very careful here. The chair, I hope the chair can take my weight. It's a bit slippery. Yes, Prof, you've spoken well. The challenge I see basically is one that has to do with an environment that is occupied with a mishmash of a neoliberal experiment and also with the challenge of tradition. The reconciliation has created a certain type of marriage that has challenged the filmmakers in terms of content and in terms of expressing themselves. Yes, you spoke a while on it, but I think it needs emphasis, the whole issue of African identity, because it's very key. I remember the classic story about a white anthropologist a while ago here in Africa who had a basket of sweets, and he kept the basket of sweets at a distance from some children. He told the children, the first one of you that gets to that tree will collect all the sweets. And he was shocked when the kids started consulting each other. They didn't run for the sweets. They held each other's hands and walked to the sweets, and they shared the sweets amongst each other. So the anthropologist was surprised. He asked them, why did you do that? They had one word, and that word was Ubuntu. I see myself in you. That was the explanation. And truly, that is the platform that we must explore in terms of who we are as a people, resolving that identity crisis, but at the same time, what we feed in as our films. So that brings, again, to another level, the question, a challenge system like this, can it afford the luxury of what expressions can possibly be, like you have in the West and a few other places? Shouldn't the challenge basically be one in terms of identification as a process? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Obanya. I mean, you just made it, when you made reference to Ubuntu, I thought that that was a very powerful analysis, because I think it harks back to my comment on Kelani's film, which is that a story about Yoruba culture shouldn't just tell us about Yoruba people. It should remind us of our collective humanity. What is it in Yoruba culture that reminds me of not just my own culture, but also of my own humanity. Now, but this is a question that I'm going to throw to Brian and hope that you reflect on it a bit. A crucial point that Professor Linus makes in his work is the idea of storytelling as a discursive site. And I think the point Linus is making is that there is a relationship between storytelling and criticality, right? That storytelling can become a process of questioning. And this is the point I'm making about the ways in which filmmakers should begin to find ways of questioning our leaders, because our leaders have learned to tell us dubious stories that enable them to stay in power. I mean, that's the only reason why, for example, we have a president where we've been told that he's the czar of anti-corruption, but he's also surrounded by very corrupt people. Because we believe in the sort of horrible stories that our leaders tell us. And I was wondering whether you could comment a bit on this idea of storytelling as a site of struggle.
Well, I think we are all at iREP. And I think iREP's ambition, as far as I know it from Femi, is to produce a different sort of storytelling. That, you know, the success of Nigeria has been Nollywood. The success has been commercial films. And commercial films have promoted certain sorts of stories. But my sense is Femi thinks there are many, many more stories that we can tell. The film last night was about a real social issue. It was very important to the filmmaker, very serious to her. And so I think iREP as a whole is to try and introduce new stories, to try and train young people to introduce new stories, which do engage with some of the issues you're talking about and move away from some of the commercial narratives. So my sense that is part of what's going on. But the other thing for me about the nature, like to come back to Prof's talk, he said at one point that to tell stories when your stories have been told by other people is a form of liberation. And so the very fact, so you know, in my book, I wrote my book on the history of cinema in Nigeria, and they said, for the longest time, to go to the cinema was to go and see other people. You could see Nigerians on NTA, but you're going to go and see Indians, or you're going to go and see Americans, or you're going to go and see English when you went to the cinema. So then when Nollywood came along, and it was producing our own stories, and in Ike Udo's documentary, everyone there is saying, finally we are telling our own stories. Well, clearly I think for Prof, my sense is the stories you're telling aren't enough. There needs to be more stories. These are some, but we also need more stories. And then, is there a politics in the very fact that you can tell a story, or is that not enough? Now we do that. The stories we tell have to be more diverse, more richer, more political than the ones we are telling. And that seems to be some of the tension where we are.
Yeah. Obaya, you, apart from the point you made about Ubuntu, you also gestured towards neoliberal globalization. Now, the point has been made here severally that content is king. But Linus is saying content is king, but we need to be aware of how we put that content together. Because remember that the story is not just the plot. It is how the main events in that story are organized to create a certain effect on our watchers and our audience. My question then is, at a moment where we are generating content obsessed with capitalist ethics, obsessed with profits, when we need to be asking ourselves very serious questions about our society, what should our filmmakers do? How do you strike a balance between the concern with business and the content with the politics of cultural production?
Thank you. What we have is a pretty confusing situation in the sense that, which I expected a bit more in terms of your paper, a certain form of dialectics in terms of the growth of our content in the form of books we've written, novels, pre-colonial, the stories we told ourselves, the myths. Because Africans are storytellers. I mean, if you read a book like Conversations with Ogotomeli by Marcel Grau, it was written in the 40s, you'd find that the Dogon of Mali told stories that had to do with our astronomy. I mean, here you have Africans who knew about the Cyrus B star, which has a periodicity of 50 years. This is a star that you don't barely see with your eyes, but they knew about it. And they were old enough to tell those stories. Sorry. Yes.
A Nigerian poet who critiques Nollywood, and he's talking about the fact that quite often it seems like the representations are done in such a way that there's no forethought to knowledge that has preceded that. It's the very thing that you're talking about. He discusses Nigerian traditional medicine and so on, the wisdoms that existed over there, the political systems that existed over there and so on, in a way that he's drawing attention to the fact that our filmmakers, our storytellers, have to know these things you're talking about, which is the very thing that you are talking about. Yeah. And it harkens also to this idea of liberal studies, learning the history and so on of whatever it is. So I agree with you, the myths and so on, but he's saying that our representations should be aware of the knowledge that have preceded them.
So true, so true. Now, so what we have basically is a situation where people are compelled to dig into what they have around them. And you must admit with me that what we have around us right now is very challenged. Because, I mean, when you're talking filmmaking, there has to be a nexus. The nexus between institutional support. Institutional support here comes by way of financing, you know, the understanding from institutions, the financial institutions, or even the system, the government, that there has to be support. Then, of course, with the educational system, because the educational system is very key to people appreciating who they are as a people and their environment. Then tied to the appreciation of the expressions, the output of our expressions. Because if you look around, we have lots of content, people who have written books. I mean, you go to the United States, for example, a lot of the films are based on books that have been written, autobiographies or even stories, depending on the genre. So what we are not doing is tapping into this basic interconnectivity that we have. And we're only as good as the environment that we are in. But there can be a direction, and that direction will basically come from people like you, from people like Prof here, people like you who are involved on the intellectual side of this, whilst hopefully other areas in society do their bit, the media and all, in stirring up the importance of which filmmaking conveys on us, basically. I hope I've come close to it.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Like I say, I think another crucial point that you made was the idea of storytelling as a commentary on the human condition. But I think what I was hearing you saying in making that point was that storytelling itself can also become philosophical work of a certain kind. But that also reminded me of a crucial point, perhaps a radical one, which John made in his talk, where in forging the connections between storytelling and liberal arts education, he hinted at the fact that Nigerian politicians would burn in hell. I would actually push it further, that I don't think we're patient enough for them to go and burn in hell. I think they should burn here. And I'm wondering whether our filmmakers, given the point you make about the relationship between storytelling and philosophical work, whether our filmmakers need to begin to think about how they can create stories that would function as political weapons to galvanize our people, not to wait for God, but to actually really burn our politicians right here. And I'm wondering, Brian, whether this idea of storytelling and philosophical work is something you want to talk about a bit, which Linus hinted at in his work. Yeah.
Well, there's two things about storytelling. One are the stories, and the second are the platforms you can tell them on. And so the issue is, if you have a story, where can you do it? Does it go to a film festival? Does it go to television? Will it get on the cinema? And effectively, commercially, your story has to fit, otherwise it will not get relayed. So in Nigeria, historically, Nigerians always had stories, but they didn't have the control of the cinema in order to have those stories seen there. Now they do have control, but to get your film to film house, it's probably not going to be a story that will be telling you to tear down the government, I'm guessing. I think, again, what iREP is trying to do is trying to find a space to both make films and then maybe use the internet on new platforms to find other means by which different sorts of stories can get out there in the world. But that's not an issue of storytelling. That's also an issue of developing the platform on which the stories can traffic. The second point I would make is, this is a more general one, is I teach in New York, and next Tuesday, I'm in the middle of my semester, I'm in the middle of a class on Indian and Nigerian films. Nollywood and Bollywood in that sense. Partly because I was interested in popular cinema that is globally popular outside of its own country that is not America. I was always interested in, America isn't the only place that makes culture. Many, many places make culture. We focus on America, but there are many others that do it. And Indian and Nigerian films are two globally powerful cinemas that tell their own stories. And so there's 81 students in the class. Many are of African descent, many are of South Asian, Indian, Pakistani descent, and most are just white people who have never seen Indian films, never seen Nigerian films. And so what is remarkable, back to your point about storytelling being universal, there are elements of Nigerian films that are deeply Nigerian, that are not obvious to the Indians watching it. There are elements of Indian films that are based in their deep religious traditions that are not obvious to the Nigerians watching it, or to the white people watching it. But nonetheless, the stories work. Every year I've taught this, I see people really react to the stories. I see people coming from all different sorts of backgrounds. So there is an element, and partly what they are, even when they don't understand it, they understand this is something deeply Nigerian. It's not mine, but it's interesting to me. But the stories work, and they work beyond any one group. This is why Indian films are popular all over the world and have been for like 50 years or more. Because stories do have that, they have to work beyond one location. Yes, you lose things, because if you don't know the realities of Nigeria or of politics in Nigeria, you won't get all the nuances of a film, but the larger ideas do come across. And so I think the thing you were pointing at, Nigerian films have had that capacity to reach beyond a home audience and appeal across the continent and even outside the continent.
Thank you. We're going to take one question before you.
I just wanted to ask or say, because, okay, thank you, all you eggheads, you've been telling us so much, but we that are making the films or interested in making the films, we also want you to hear from us. So apart from making the films, telling our stories, we want to do that, but the main thing is distribution. Now, okay, thank God for iREP, is focused on documentaries. I've been saying it for the past few years, that all these beautiful documentaries that a few of us see, since Uncle Efo, seems to be very good friends with them and multi-choice or whatever, why can't we see them on like Africa Magic also, just like how you have History Channel and all, that's one. Okay, someone like me, I'm an emerging filmmaker, I have done an animation short film. Now, you start from somewhere, and you also want to make money from the small thing you've done. We don't have distribution channels that cater to things, for people like us. People will not take, shorts. So how do you go? Because, like in my own case, I wrote this story in 1994 after I watched Lion King. I wrote Walt Disney about it. They replied me 3 years later that they don't take stories from people. I wrote a studio in South Africa about it. They did not even reply. I said, you know what? I will get this thing out anyhow. I'll get it out. Okay, I put it in YouTube. I'm not making any money from it. I've only sent it to film, festivals. So how am I encouraged, to keep on? And we know how it is for you to even get funding for your film. I self-funded that. I've not gotten my returns, but at least I was happy to have gotten this 25-year-old child out of my system. So that's one of the things. We want to tell our stories, but at the end of the day, you have to bring home the bacon. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, bring home the bacon. It's important. At the end of the day, that's what's so critical. I think to begin to address that issue of distribution, to begin to address the issue of young, developing, aspiring filmmakers, has to be one that is tied to the institutional setup in the country. We talked about India. Indians, checked it out, you will find that there was some form of government support, and that directed them in a certain type of film genre. If you check the Chinese, there was emphasis on kung fu, Shaolin monks, and so forth. They sold a certain type of genre, you know, and gave it support to get that kind of global wide audience. Because, you see, a number of these governments realize that there's soft power. The real power is not hard power, it's soft power. Exposition of your culture. So for a young, aspiring film, it's tough, I must admit, getting funding, because you're not the only one. There are a number of people with ideas, lots of people who have come up with their own films. So it's dependent again on institutional support. The government, I keep saying it, if the government does not have a guaranteed support by way of financing, I mean, financing guarantees. I know the last administration, the Jonathan administration mentioned or had, there was a pool of funds that you could draw from. I don't know what happened in the long, whether people were able to draw from that funding. I think about 200, was it 200 million? Which I felt was so scanty. I mean, it was insulting, considering what Nollywood had done. Or was it in dollars? Oh, it was dollars. Brilliant. But what has happened to it? Nobody said, I'm yet to find out any filmmakers that have tapped into this huge pool of money. Because, you see, it's so critical we have the government back it. It is only when the government sees, it is only when the finance companies, the banks, and so forth, venture capitalists see government support. That is only when you can find the kind of mass pool of funding for aspiring filmmakers. And you not find a lot of people who are trained to tap into that area, as bankers and so forth. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Brian, 50 seconds.
I would just echo what Prof just said. The issue is not just when the government gives 200 million, they're giving 200 million for production. And what you're saying, the issue is the other end, it's distribution. We have to tell our stories, but then we have to get our stories out there some way. And as much attention on distribution and exhibition has to come, not just on production.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sorry, we're totally out of time. If we're going to take questions, we won't leave here for the next 1 hour. So I would say that can they ask you their questions directly, Professor Linus, Professor Larkin, Professor Ogo, Professor... Can they ask you their questions directly? They can, fantastic. So please, if you have questions, you can ask them directly. Please put your hands together for them. Thank you. These are conversations that will keep going on and on and on because we're still in a very developing industry. So thank you, sirs. Volunteers, please come and help me get the chairs in front. The festival is not over for the day. We still have 2 films. We still have 2 films screening here now. Thank you. Thank you. Please, let's settle down. Please, let us settle down. Thank you. We have a film screening now. Thank you. Thank you. We have 2 film screenings now, and then we have the evening screenings at the amphitheater. But I'm going to call up the next filmmaker who is with us. Caroline Rocker. She came all the way from Germany. Please put your hands together for her. I'd like to call her up to introduce her film. One of the reasons why I'm not saying the name of the film is so that I don't murder the name of the film. It's German, obviously, so it's French. It's French. I was just going to say Salé. No, let me not try it. So she will introduce her film, and at the end of the film, we'll have a time for question and answers with her. So please, I'll ask you to please sit down, listen to her, and once she's done, watch and enjoy the film. Thank you. Caroline Rocker.
Yes. Hello. First of all, thank you, iREP, and everybody for inviting me here. It's really an honor to be here in Lagos with you all. This is a film it took me 3 years to do this film, and I did this. This is like my final student film. So I got support from my school. I got the material, and we got a small budget, but we also ran out of money. So at the end, I had to pay on the debts from my own pocket. But yeah, well, maybe I can tell you more about how this project developed. It's when it comes to storytelling, this is like an experiment for me. It's not a conventional storytelling here. It's more like, well, maybe I shouldn't talk about it too much, but I hope you enjoy it, and yeah, I hope you stay, then I can answer all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Stay and enjoy the film. Thank you.